I'm just delighted to welcome those of you here in person and those of you coming in via Zoom to our first seminar of fall term. This is a college-wide seminar with a series. They're every Friday from 1 to 2. And this whole term we will do in person and via Zoom. So thank you for coming. And I sent out the entire list, but if you would like me to resend it to you, please let me know. And we will send out announcements each week about what seminar we will be sponsoring or hosting. Okay, let's get started. I just want to quickly turn this over to Don Jump. Dr. Jump is a professor in the nutrition program, and he is graciously agreed to introduce our speaker and to facilitate this seminar. So Don, it's all yours.
Hi there and welcome. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Russell Turner. I've known Dr. Turner, or Russ, essentially since I've been here since 2007. He arrived here in 2005. Before getting here, if we go back a couple years, he received his bachelor's and master's and PhD from Penn State University in biochemistry and biophysics. And after that, he went on to some other institutions, but I'm not going to tell you all of those institutions except the one that he was at just prior to coming here, and that was the Mayo Clinic, where he spent many years involved in bone research. So when I think of Russ, I think of what he works on, all things bone. And that is, he's a very well-known investigator in this field. It's been well funded over the years. His funding has come from the NIH and NASA. He's the only person I know who has a NASA grant. Incredible. It's resulted in over 300 publications, H-index of 72, which means not only is he publishing, people are reading it and they're using it, which is a really good index of the impact of Russ on his field. So without further, I need to tell you that if you're wanting to ask a question during Russ's seminar, please wait to the end where we will essentially accumulate them. And you want to use the Q&A component of Zoom for that. Is that correct? Yeah, as I said, when we have Zoom meetings, it's normally shouting. Anyway, but please don't shout. I don't think you can. We can hear you. And so without further ado, I'll let Russ take over. And he's going to be talking about the obesity epidemic. It's a big problem. Big problem in many ways. Here we go.
Some people do that on their face masks. I was thinking that he and I could kind of get together. Well, yeah, sure.
We'll try it this way, see if it works.
How does that appear underneath like your first button?
Let's try that. Well, thanks for coming. It's really great to see people live. And the title of this, The Obesity Epidemic, is for sure worse than the disease. Something I've been interested in a substantial period of time from a number of different directions. As Don mentioned, I do work in space. Have you ever thought about what the body mass index of an astronaut is? It's 0. So what impact does it have? Okay. Well, interesting. I have something covering up my title up there, but you know, why is this subject of any importance? The question. The subject, I don't think there's any problem with people thinking it's important, but this particular question that I raised, why is the question that I posed the important question? One of which there's been tremendous discrepancies in the literature in terms of what the impact of obesity is upon excess annual deaths. They've ranged from 25,000 to 400,000 in publications that came out months apart. Okay, so there's a lot of disagreement with this. I think there's a real poor appreciation of the mechanisms that lead to undesirable weight gain. And I use the word appreciation for two ways. One of which is there's a lot we don't know, but there's a lot we know quite a bit about that's really not well appreciated. Okay, so we'll come back to that as we go along. There's a really poor efficacy in terms of our interventions, whether it's an intervention that's based on behavioral modification or it's intervention based on a treatment, drug treatment. We have not had great success, and there's a lot of undesirable effects in terms of the intervention. And this is what I want to point out: when we get it wrong, it can have a real consequence in terms of the individuals. And so this is one of the things that I'd really like us to think about. And I'll see if we can advance this. Is there some sort of secret?
Maybe you have to do it.
I'm trying to figure out why it's doing this.
Okay, well, I did it. Right then. So, the first concern we have here, the first aspect, and this is really what this presentation is going to be about, is sort of defining the condition, defining obesity. What is obesity? How has obesity changed in America or the world? But here we're going to focus on America over the last few decades. What factors have led to those changes? What are the health implications of these changes? Why do people become obese, overweight or obese? And why is our response been so ineffective? Now, obviously, in the next 40 minutes, we're going to only cover this in a fairly superficial fashion. But if you're a student, and we have a lot of students out here, which I'm great to see, if you're interested in the subject, that Ursula and I do a class called Weight Control that's held in the spring. And it's co-listed as nutrition and kinesiology. We have $5.99, $6.99 if you're interested in the subject. So, basically, how do we define obesity? Well, as you heard, my background's in physics, biophysics. And so I like formulas. I like formulas that we can describe something in a number. And so we have that BMI, body mass index, which, as I'm sure you're aware of, is our mass in kilograms divided by our height in meters. A nice, simple number. Unfortunately, there are issues with BMI. One of which is weight and height are continuous variables. So when we do this calculation, BMI greater than 30, greater than equal to 30 is obese, it has no physical meaning. Okay, so when you think obesity, we look at it, we know, we see it. But what happens when you don't see it? You don't see the individual, or the individual's in the next room. Okay, we have to have some way of being able to describe it. BMI is what we use, but it has no physical meaning. So you don't know what that individual looks like by just looking at BMI. Body composition is not considered. In body composition, we know lots of evidence is really important, okay? Another way of describing this, defining it, is a weight higher than a healthy weight. I think that's logical, and that's something that we can all kind of accept as being true. The problem with that is it assumes a uniform relationship between weight and health outcomes. That doesn't exist. And so in reality, the simple thing of what is obesity is something I don't think we have a very good description for. So that's what we're starting at. That's the point we're starting. Now, what has happened with BMI? Because this is the indicator we have. One big advantage of BMI. We've been collecting information on this since well back into the 19th century. So we've got historical information. So this is NHANES data across about 25 years. And here is our so-called obesity epidemic, the changes that occurred over that period of time. And clearly there has been a shift of BMI to higher numbers. There's a gradual shift over time. The base of the distribution curve has widened preferentially at the higher levels. But look at this carefully. We see back in the good old days, in the late 70s, look where the peak was. Okay?
Russ,
Yes.
we're going to interrupt you because I think we're going to try to make the mic work just a little bit better.
Okay. I
For
will
the
stop.
people on Zoom, they got turned off in their pocket. Yeah, it did.
I'll carry it.
Well, what you can do is just clip this on your back pocket. Stay.
Oh, I'm glad you thought of it.
Okay, great. I have lots of pockets, but not so easy to clip.
Just so people know, we have over 50 people in Zoom.
Well, I'm great. So going again, while we're fooling around here, I can still show the point I want to make, is there were a lot of people, I'm one of them, in this period of time, that kind of woke up one morning being normal weight and going to bed overweight. That happened to a lot of people. And the same sort of thing occurred either in going from overweight to basically obese. The point that I'm making here is that this is not something that is an epidemic in the sense of an epidemic or a pandemic like we're having now. It didn't appear like this. This process has been going on based on historical data for the last 100 years. Okay, it's probably sped up a bit. So now the question is, what's causing it? So the first thing I want to do is round up the usual suspects, okay? And where did the usual suspects come from? And that came from doing a fairly thorough literature search back some time ago. When I wanted to look at it, is what are associated with the obesity epidemic? And here's the list that I came up with. Okay, highly processed, energy-dense fast food. That was always number one on the list, okay? Too much time sitting in front of one of these things, a screen of a various time. Low levels of physical activity. Okay, food deserts, food insecurity, poverty. These are all on the list of terms, and there's associations, no question. So can anybody else name anything else? Think of anything else that should be on this list? Well,
Lack of sleep.
perfect. You forgot shift work and inadequate sleep. And so Maura pointed that out very nicely. I have to mention that was one of our articles about weight, is in terms of that, and she certainly was impressed. Any case, so all right, we have this. Now what do we do? And you start thinking about, okay, we could kind of modify, we can look at sleep, what sort of experiments we could do. And I'm sitting in the morning breakfast here with Maura again. You know, targeting single risk factors just hasn't worked that well. It's hard to do, targeting one. And so many of these risk factors are codependent. Fix them all. Let's just fix them all. Okay, now to do this, we could run to the NIH. Good luck. Okay, try to do the study. Or we can do something, a thought experiment. I like thought experiments. So here's a thought experiment. Thought experiments go back a long time. This is probably the most famous thought experiment out there, is Einstein. Twins. We're going to come back to twins. Twins in different environments. Okay, one environment is moving high speed through space. And he was using this as an illustration of what would happen in terms of the general theory of relativity, in terms of relativity of time. And the astronaut who was moving at fast speed coming back appears to be much younger than his twin, okay? But that's certainly not the first thought experiment. We have Maxwell. Maxwell created a devil. Maxwell was interested in thermodynamics. And he created the devil to try to look at violating the laws of thermodynamics. We in nutrition seem to do that a lot. We come up with theories that violate the laws of physics, okay? And we'll come to that a little bit. Schrodinger's cat was the idea of investigating some of the really weird things that would occur with quantum mechanics, okay? But it turns out quantum mechanics is really important. That's why your cell phone works inside a building, okay? So you see quantum mechanics all the time. Now, with Schrodinger, what's important is quantum thermodynamics, which turns out actually to be really important. Only occurs at the really tiny scale, but the implications are important in terms of the fact that we exist is important. But the one I really want to point out here goes back a long, long time, and this is Galileo. And you think about Galileo what? You think of the telescope, you think about the moons of Jupiter, the rings of Saturn discovering, but he made some very important fundamental discoveries. This is a publication that is very readable now in English, unless you speak Italian, Dialogue on Two New Sciences. And what Galileo was attempting to do is he was making the argument, remember, we're talking about 17th century early, about the existence of giants. And he wanted to show mathematically, by relationship, giant human beings could not exist, or at least not look like us. And what he did is he was This is a principle of scaling. And so here is a normal person, 5 foot tall, the length of a long bone. And this is what Galilei showed what the long bone would have to look like to have the same strength, relative strength, of someone who's 15 foot tall. It can't happen. Okay? Well, elephants have much bigger bones than mice. Well, they're a lot bigger. But not only do they have bigger bones, it makes up a higher percentage of their body mass, much larger, scaling. And so this is something essentially, he was laying a criticism about BMI, which brings things to the second power, 200 years before it was actually invented. So you really can't use BMI for comparing populations that are different statures. It's not going to mean the same thing. You can't compare men and women. Generally, there's a different statures. We have a problem with historical data. Okay, so this is a sort of thing, one of the limitations. So here's back to our experimental design. What we're going to do is try to correct everything that we see as we think is a problem in people. It's got to be long duration study, multiple generations I'd like to see. So we have none of these problems in this population. But in addition, we're going to have a genetically matched control population. So can we do this? Is it an experiment that's doable? Yeah, this is a thought experiment. Okay, it's very doable. Here's our population. Yeah. Okay, these people are living in where I grew up. Okay, the Amish. You would be removed from society if you basically were using a computer. Okay, so essentially, and we have a genetically matched population, people who left the Amish. Okay, so we can look and see, have they been protected against obesity? Here's the data from this study, published about a decade ago. Look at the BMI that is in a normal range, below 25. The male controls actually have higher percentage of the population that are in the normal range. Minimal difference, no significant difference in the overweight, but look at the obesity. The Amish, and again, these are individuals who are like middle-aged, 50s. Middle age gets younger and younger as you age. But anyway, or I said gets older and older. One of those directions. But see what we see in the situation. These people are not protected. Now, one of the things I really want to throw out here, they're not protected from obesity. But if you look at health outcomes, they do very well on a lot of the things we associate with problems with obesity. So that's something to keep in mind, that they do well in spite of the fact that. So, okay, where do we go from here? Well, what I want to go from here is basically talk a little bit about biological factors. Okay, we talked about behavioral. Well, now let's talk about biological. And here we go back to those twins who separated at birth and raised in different households, different environments. Genetic predisposition, we know, is incredibly important for body size. Okay, it's not the only factor, but it's incredibly important. Aging of the population, well, you don't think about it. Well, guess what? You reach your peak stature when you're a teenager. Okay, but people, whether you're in the 10th percentile or the 90th percentile weight, continue to add weight as you age, at least up into your 50s. And then it may flatten out and may go down a little bit as you really get older. So what happens to this BMI data that we're looking at in Haynes, that didn't take that into account. And so a portion of that increase in BMI that we're seeing in Americans is actually due to the fact we're aging, our population. That's part of it. That makes up a fraction of it. Improved diet. Believe it or not, diets have improved in the last 100 years. Okay, what's accessible to us. Improved health has also been a factor. Things like vaccines when you're a kid have been really helpful. But the one I really want to point out that everyone would automatically buy into is a big reduction in smoking. Public health efforts in terms of reducing smoking. Smoking is a big suppressor of appetite. And therefore, part of the increase in BMI is the reduction of smoking. Okay, so this is one of the things I want to say. Hey, how do we reduce obesity? Encourage people to smoke. Do you buy that? It will work. Okay. Side effects of ineffective interventions. These twin studies where there's been a discrepancy in the weight is often associated with one of the twin dieting. It's one of the biggest risk factors for increased weight in twins is dieting, okay? And of course, there's behavioral contributions. We don't want to leave that out. That's clearly going to be there. Now, what I want to point out in this curve is something I think important, is that, you know, everybody in this room has got a good background in terms of statistics and so on and so forth. And you look at this curve and you can say right away, it ain't normal distribution, okay? It isn't a normal distribution. And so there's pretty good evidence now that once we get out to this period of distance out here, we are dealing with probably mechanistically something different going on. And this is where, in fact, we can see 1 or 2 or 3 genes can be responsible for that very high level of obesity, morbid obesity. And as an example, this is one of them. That child, okay, is morbidly obese at age 5, okay? And basically we know that that individual had a loss of function in expression or in the gene for leptin, a hormone that's involved in appetite regulation. And that's what has occurred. And when leptin had been cloned, of course, this was all done at a very short interval of time. First thing to do is administer leptin. This is the same child 3 years later, normal, okay? So this population down there, we're seeing more and more, and we see the same thing, we have a mouse model, okay? Leptin deficiency in the mouse results in morbid obesity. So I think that's sort of important to say, this is a different group. But right here, I want to focus mostly on the normal. The other thing I want to look at is that the vast majority of our population falls in this interval from about here to about here. And I want you to think about that in a couple minutes. Okay, now what effect does it have on health and longevity? So these are studies that were done. I'm going to go back to a fellow named Waller, Scandinavian, did most of his work in Norway. And this is called a Waller plot. He did a lot of this work in the 60s and 70s. And what he was looking for was, in fact, the ideal BMI. And so what he did is he has in this one about 15 million subject years of data. And what he found, I think much to his surprise to begin with, is there isn't. That if you take, as what he would say, significance has to be greater than a 1.2 on this relative risk, and you go across here, it goes from about 18 to 33 BMI. There's no difference in mortality in men, similar with women. This was a pretty big of a shock. Now, one of the things I wanted, this is old data. I used the old data on purpose because to say, we have known this for this long a time. That in fact, that when you look at the population level, there is really minimum difference in mortality between people who are normal weight, overweight, and at the lower end of obese. We start seeing this really go up on either side, but really 90+% of our population falls in this area, which there is really no good evidence for, that there's much of an effect at the population level on mortality. That is a shocker to people, but this has been reproduced. People come up with slightly different numbers, but this is something that's been highly reproduced. How do you explain it? Well, he had data that gave us an idea. Basically, the data was that there are conditions that can lead to death, that having a higher weight is protective. There are other conditions, and these are digestive, pulmonary, some cancers, certain cancers. And then we have other ones in which as you increase your BMI, you are at an increased risk. Okay, so we are dealing with this situation where they tend to cancel each other out. And so I think this is something that was a very important observation. Again, this has been reproduced. So often when you see somebody say, okay, there's an increased risk of breast cancer with weight, the answer is yes, that's true if it happens to be postmenopausal women and they're looking at estrogen receptor dependent cancer. But if you're looking at triple negative cancer, that may not be the case, or if you're looking at premenopausal, it's not true.
So when you only look at one condition, you can come to a conclusion about weight, which is true for that condition. So where are we? What happens when you lose weight? Well, here's one of my interests is osteoporosis, okay? And the question is, when you reduce weight, an astronaut does it to the maximum possible effect, weight goes to zero. But you have a decreased risk for type 2 diabetes, but you increase your risk for osteoporosis. So part of my research and research that Ursula and I do together is the idea how we can get the benefit of reduced weight in types of diabetes without increasing the risk of osteoporosis. And so that's something I think it's really important to keep in mind, is that when we're looking at the whole. So here, the take-home messages from this is the association between BMI and disease incidence outcome is disease specific. Really strong evidence for that. Reducing one risk factor with weight loss or gain may result in increased risk of other factors. So we have to sort of take that into consideration. Most, but not all studies indicate that the optimal BMI is between 18.5 and 32, which represents 90+% of our population, okay, or in this. However, the BMI has also been shifting with over time to higher levels, but the change in what would be optimal has been shifting. So we look at 19th century, the optimal BMI was clearly much lower than it is now. We don't understand exactly what's going on, but that's something that's happening. There is absolutely no scientific basis to conclude that a BMI in the overweight range is unhealthy at the population level. Individuals, it may be, but at the population level. A BMI of over 35 really, truly has a significant negative impact on the health. There's no questions about that. But the mechanisms leading to this are likely different than is average for the normal population, okay? So that's something else to consider. So the biological basis, let's go into what's happening. Those are Cheetos. Cheetos contain energy that could be used to do work or energy that could actually be used to create heat. In this particular case, we're using it to create heat. We use the Cheeto. The Cheeto is very excellent as a fire starter if you're camping. Cheetos are perfect. You light it because they burn, and they burn for a long period of time at a nice temperature, and this fire was started with Cheetos. Okay, so this is the connection between thermodynamics, energy, metabolism, and so forth in terms of this. So what is weight gain? Well, weight gain is a condition in which the energy consumes exceeds the energy expended, and as a result, we end up with increased storage of energy, often fat. Okay, so this is technically correct, but it's useless. I mean, where do we go from that? That's something, yes, we all understand, but it doesn't really help us very much in terms of determining it. Any useful theory regarding unwanted weight gain has to solve this paradox, okay? The average American adult consumes around 900 kilograms of food a year. That's a ton, almost a ton of food. A chronic imbalance of 10 kilocalories. 10 kilocalories is slightly more than a half of a teaspoon of sugar. A chronic imbalance of that is sufficient if it's plus or minus in explaining most obesity and anorexia. That's the energy balance difference that we're talking about. 10 kilocalories a day, okay? That's how small it is. A weight-stable person can vary their energy intake by several hundred calories a day without necessarily gaining or losing weight. This is our paradox that we have to explain, this difference between how much energy that we're working with and how much. Well, if you quickly calculate in your head what 9 kilograms is versus how much we consume, that means that in order to maintain stable body weight requires a energy balance that has to be 99.9% perfect. So individuals who are becoming morbidly obese have probably at least a 99% energy balance. Okay, and I think that is phenomenal. Okay, so how do we go about looking at this, explaining this? Our standard deterministic model. This is what people are taught in nutrition, including including classes I teach. Okay, it's based on this idea of this balance. This is your food in. This is basically your physical activity and other metabolism, the requirements. Determinism is okay. I don't mind determinism. It's how we predict eclipses. You know all the information, you can make a prediction. We can determine an eclipse to a millisecond hundreds of years in advance. Okay, so there's nothing necessarily wrong with determinism. This is from the Brown book. This is from a course that I teach. And basically it's saying, hey, energy adjustments for weight change. That a pound of our body is equivalent to roughly 3,500 calories. Roughly, that's correct. Okay, we go on that. And that, if you really want to lose weight, you could lose a pound in a week. You could lose a pound in a week if you can change the energy balance by 500 calories. How do you do that? Well, you do an extra 2 miles of walking, a couple hundred calories there, and you basically cut out some of those Cheetos, and you cut out a soda, and you can do it, and you do that for a week, and this is how it works, okay? So you look at this, there's nothing obviously wrong with this statement. And on the other hand, the positive energy balance of just 100 calories per day could lead up to 10 pounds in 1 year. 10 pounds in 1 year, 40 pounds in 40 years. No, 4 years. 4 years, 4 years. In other words, big weight changes. So is it true? Why is it important? Take home message from this is weight control is easy. It is. If that's all you do, it's easy. You know, slight adjustment here, slight adjustment here. An international survey of more than 300 policy makers reported that more than 90% believed that personal motivation was strong or a very strong influence on the rise of obesity. Okay, that's scary to me, okay, because of how we're going to look at it. But we need proof that this is wrong. Let's test the model. So we alter one side of the equation because it's a balance. You got to alter one side and you see what happens. So you got to be able to measure things carefully. You have to be able to measure how much food is taken in. You have to measure activity levels. It has to be long enough to see it change. This is really difficult to perform in people, although many of us have actually tried this experiment on ourselves. Okay, it's very difficult, but we can do something else. We can go to a mouse. Okay, this type of mouse. Okay, so we go to this type of mouse. So this study was asking what happens if we calorically restrict the mouse by 5%? We have control group, we see how much you're eating, and we reduce this one by 5%. What happens? That's pretty modest, pretty modest. Here were the results. There wasn't any weight loss. I'm not shocked about that, but there was a redistribution of weight. The mice basically ended up with having less muscle and more fat when this was happened. This was due to decreased energy expenditure, resting energy expenditure. I'll come back to that concept in a little bit. So these findings in this experiment are not exactly what we consider to be desirable, and they're also not something we predict from our model. But this is a mouse. We need to kind of look at what happens in a human being. What about humans? Okay, this is a study, this is an experiment. I can't imagine being able to get past the IRB, but it involved something in which there was a program, and maybe some of you probably watched it. It was something called The Biggest Loser. Anybody watch that? Anybody see that? The Biggest Loser. My idea was that something like they're looking at who won this, lost the most amount of weight, and something along those lines. So these were people who were kind of involved in this. And so the idea was if you basically caloric restriction to a point where you have to lose weight, and then you do what else? You do something, a lot of physical activity. So what they did is they measured the adjusted resting metabolic rate of these individuals before they started on this program, okay? And so this is our line that you get in terms of doing that. And then what they did is they basically lost weight. And what would be predicted is because if you lose weight, then you don't need as much energy to maintain your body because there's less body to maintain. So the idea is you would slide down this line. That would be the expectation. That's not what was observed. What was observed is after this intervention, these people, they came down, but they left the line and they came down to lower values by equivalent of about 550 calories a day. Now, what does that mean? Do a thought experiment here. You have an identical twin. Your identical twin, for whatever reason, gained a whole bunch of weight. Okay, Then your identical twin goes and exercises and does caloric restriction, does dieting, and comes back down to your weight. In order to maintain their weight, they have to consume 550 calories less than you do. Life's not fair. Okay. Basically, this is one of the main reasons why diets fail, is you can lose the weight, but there's an adaptive process going on. Okay, so here, going back to this energy adjustment, what's problem with this is right here. Positive balance of just 100 calories. Calories consumed in physical activity do not predict energy balance. You can't change one side of the equation without changing the other. Trivial example on here. Basically, you eat some food. There's enzymes that are produced to digest that. If you go down to a lower amount of food consumption, you no longer need as much of those digestive enzymes. There's an adaptive process that reduces their production. This whole process of making them requires energy. So you've lowered your energy costs, okay, by doing something. So every one of these is affected in complicated ways. Humans and rodents are protected against weight loss and from a negative energy balance from starvation as a result of positive and adaptive mechanisms, a whole complex set of them. So if you change one side of this equation, you change the other. They're not independent of one another. And so the adaptive mechanisms are not considered in that model we're teaching students. They're not considered. The adaptive mechanisms aren't part of it, okay? So these studies so far that we've discussed don't really address whether there's adaptive mechanisms going the other direction. In other words, we're looking at protection against weight loss. How about weight gain? So this is something that we've done. Here's my helper in terms of doing an experiment. That's her. And so Xerxes is looking over, checking our data. And so what this experiment was set up to is asking the questions, how many excess calories are required for normal age-related weight gain? Normal diet. We're not doing anything exotic. So we're using an animal that's old enough, they're not growing in length anymore. Okay. We have a control that's given the normal diet. And then what we do is we just cut the calories, cut the diet just enough to prevent further weight gain. Okay. Long enough, 18 weeks. That's about the equivalent in relative lifespan of 10 years in a person doing that in the rat. And here's our results. Our starting weight, 285 grams, 284 for our control. We did pretty good. Okay, at the end, our animals that are just ad libitum eating gained 4%. Not a lot, but that's really typical, the sort of thing we would see in a human, 4% over this 10 year. Maybe it's a little lower than we'd see some. It's a difference in 11 grams. Okay, and our control, hey, went from 284 to 284. Well, we did a really good job on that it was basically no weight gain. Now look at the food difference. 2121 in the controls and 1890, that's an 11% difference in food intake in order to prevent this increase. Now, we're not causing starvation. We're just keeping them where they are. It's status quo. Let's translate that to a person. 4% increase in a body weight. Somebody 150 pounds is about 6 pounds. Okay. Now, based on our model saying 1 pound of our body is worth 3,500 calories, in order to prevent that from occurring, we need to basically reduce our intake by 21,000 calories. 6 calories a day. 6 calories a day is a little bit less than a half a teaspoon of sugar. I think that's 8 calories. Okay, it's very, very tiny amount. But in our experiment here, extrapolating if we can to a human being, we come up with 800,000 calories you would have to reduce to prevent the weight. Okay. That would translate to 228 pounds of a person. Okay, so this data indicates that adaptive responses limit weight gain as well as limit weight loss. This is great news to all of us because we'd all be a lot heavier if it weren't for this process. What I would like to do is propose that here in America, we are all consuming enough food that we have to be in this adaptive range, because we have food availability enough that we could gain a lot more weight than we do if it weren't for this adaptive process. So here's a hypothesis. The standard methods of diet and exercise to prevent unwanted weight or induce weight loss generally fail because of these adaptive responses. Okay, and so the energy consumption where adaptive mechanisms can kind of equalize things are very large compared to what we need in terms of energy imbalance to result in us in weight gain or weight loss by hundreds of calories, in fact. It's a really, really big. So what about this idea? Enhancing the adaptive response. Can we enhance the adaptive response to prevent this from occurring? If we can do that, we may be able to reduce side effects and be more effective, okay? That's the idea. Going back to that hormone leptin I mentioned, that's one of the ones that we would think about. These are produced by fat cells. They tell the brain what your energy reserves are, okay? That's one of their functions. They also allocate energy to various processes like your immune system and growth. They regulate both sides of the energy equation, appetite and non-shivering thermogenesis, which is a method of controlling our energy expenditure. It basically, if you have the deficiency, we know we have morbid obesity. And leptin treatment will restore normal balance in individuals who are severely leptin deficient. Now, of course, you might say, well, why don't we just treat people with leptin? That's all we have to do. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way because people who are overweight or more have plenty of leptin. We have leptin resistance, somewhat similar to insulin resistance that occurs in diabetes. Multiple ways in which you can have leptin resistance. One, if you don't have the receptor, that results in morbid obesity. One of the important ways that we think is important is the leptin that's produced by adipocytes has to get to the brain and has to cross the blood-brain barrier. There's a limited capacity to do that, okay? So here's the model. The model is that if you're very leptin sensitive, what this is your energy reserve. We all need fat. Fat is really important to have. We all need it, but we need limited amounts, okay? So if you're low on fat, you have a regulatory process to promote fat storage. If you got enough, now we have processes that promote fat oxidation. So fat storage, fat oxidation, if you're leptin sensitive, this is kind of narrow between storing and burning. Okay, out here, if you have total resistance like no receptor, then this is a huge, huge amount that will result in obesity. Most of us, 90% of us, are in between at some level. Can we modify that? How would you modify it? So here our hypothesis is that most humans and laboratory animals and pets, okay, who are healthy and have continuous access to food will gain weight with age due to partial leptin resistance. How much we gain will depend upon the magnitude of the resistance. And I don't want to say this is the only mechanism, okay, but I think this is we're illustrating it as being one of the mechanisms. If we can increase the amount of leptin in the brain, we might be able to tell the brain, hey, you got too much energy. Let's get rid of some of it and let the brain do the work for us. This will reduce fat stores, okay? That's the idea. How do we do that? Well, okay, we do it by doing gene therapy. And this is a study that Ursula did. We did this with collaboration with people at the University of Florida. But the experiment we're going to show is one that Ursula delivered the gene for leptin through a recombinant adeno-associated virus into the hypothalamus of rats. Okay, and what we want to know is how does this compare to basically dieting? Okay, so this is the experiment. Body weight across time. This is an 18-week experiment. Did a good job of balancing it. So what we have now is what did it take in order by dieting to basically give us this same weight as the one with the gene therapy. And here it is. We had to give less food to the ones that were dieting to maintain this weight. We had to give 15% less food. So in other words, these animals were they were eating ad lib. They ate as much food as they wanted to. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to maintain your weight or even lose weight by eating as much as you want? Okay, over time. And this therapy, other studies we've shown, lasts a lifetime, at least in a rat or a mouse. Okay, so here's the difference, a very substantial difference in the amount. This again would be an equivalent of probably 1 million calories over 10 years, difference in amount if we could translate to human. So what effect does it have? Our white adipose tissue, even though these animals weighed the same amount, okay? The ones that had the gene therapy had significantly less fat. Okay, they had more muscle, they had less fat. Their serum leptin levels were lower, which tells us they're going to be more leptin sensitive. They're going to be more sensitive to changes in food, so they're going to have better regulation. Of course, they're expressing leptin in their brain because we put the gene there. Okay, and then also they're expressing high levels of something called UCP1. This is something that's related to thermogenesis. This is one of the mechanisms a mouse uses, a rat uses, a human uses in order to balance for our energy balance. This is one of the reasons why we're 99.9% perfect, or all of us are probably over 99% good at energy balance, is because of things like this that are in the process that kind of take, excess energy. Well, how do we get rid of it? We get rid of it by producing heat instead of storing it. That's one of the things that's going on. So dieting and increasing hypothalamic leptin levels achieve weight stabilization by very different mechanisms. Okay, with dieting, we actually increase our fat and reduce our muscle. Okay, we have decreased resting metabolic rate. We have downregulation of metabolic processes like the immune system, which we don't want to have happen. We have increased appetite. All these things are opposing it. Why are they opposing it? When we are dieting, we are mimicking starvation. Why are we mimicking starvation? It is starvation. If you're eating fewer calories than you need to support your body system, it is starvation. This is a mechanism by which, and I'm sure there's be other ways of doing this, in which basically the brain is receiving signals that says, you have more storage of fat than you need, let's get rid of it. And you do that by reducing fat, keeping the muscle you have, maybe even increasing it. You increase your resting metabolic rate. This is permissive to allow things to grow and have your immune system, in terms of the cells there, being able to divide and go. And then you have a decrease in appetite. So we have a very, very different set. So we can conclude here that increasing BMI at the population level is a consequence of improved health, really, including food availability. We really may not necessarily be the best food. It may be too high in fat and all this sort of stuff, but food availability overall is going to be a major risk factor in terms of weight gain. The optimal BMI is actually increased over time. So that's not telling us it's bad to have that. Our war on obesity, in my view, appears misdirected, and it's contributed to the problem because not recognizing some of these things that we need to know. So I think without understanding these mechanisms, mediating energy balance at the individual level to lower BMI is likely to continue to contribute to doing at least as much harm as we're doing good. And so it may be possible to take advantage of natural adaptive responses to attenuate weight gain. We have to understand them better and understand differences, how each of us behave in terms of behave to be able to do that. But I think that's what we want to be doing. And again, I'll re-mention for students a little commercial here that if you want to know more about this, we spend a quarter talking about these issues. So finally, questions. Okay, and I ran a little bit over time. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Great talk, Russ. Thank you. Very provocative, very interesting. Now, how would you explain why in, say, European countries, where this increasing food availability has also happened over the last 150 years, the epidemic of obesity is not occurring, at least to the extent?
It's not occurring to the extent, but it is occurring. They're still growing in height. If you want, I mean, that may seem like a trivial, sort of silly explanation, but if we look at height data, this is one of these factors. Is that again? What I'm going to show you something here. Okay, this I hope is something like this is going to actually replace BMI, and this is what's called a Waller iso-mortality curve. Okay, what they have done is they've gotten completely rid of BMI, but they still have to use height and weight. And what they're doing is actually taking height and weight and plotting it and looking at one of these surfaces. And then what you've done is they calculate the mortality rates based on this relationship. And what you find is it varies a lot from country to country. And so what you see in Indonesia, the optimal BMI for a given weight is much lower than 20. It's down around 20. In Mexico, which is sort of a moderate terms of wealth, it's about 26 for a male. And in the US, based on this, is around 28 or 29. So we're seeing these differences that go on. But asking yours, I'm saying one of the reasons when I look at the data is that in the US, that our change in stature has sort of stabilized about 30 years ago. And so there's been minimal differences. In European countries, there's been continuing to increase in terms of stature. That's telling me that they're seeing the genetics hasn't changed. So what we're looking at is what happens when you have optimal sort of conditions. So what we're seeing there initially is this change and still increase in height. And therefore, the BMI is really hard to compare across there in terms of it. That is a little bit of it, but I don't think that's the whole story. And again, what we want to look at these sorts of things is that this difference often, when we're talking about it, can be a few pounds in terms of the difference is when you really calculate out what the difference between a BMI of 25 is and a BMI of 26. It is something that is a pretty small difference in weight. And so I certainly think that there are other factors that influence this, like the nutritional factors, also cultural factors can influence how people eat. All these sort of things can influence it. But what I'm trying to get across is we have a biological system that a minute difference of literally a few calories in this balance is what leads to this. And therefore, we have to figure out is not so much the calories people consume, but what could influence something that's small of a difference. And that's the part that's really challenging, because you buy a package of something and there's no way in the world that you would know the number of calories that are in it compared to the amount that could make a difference. But why does it make a difference? Okay, if we're all so good, which we are, otherwise we'd be a lot heavier or a lot lighter than we are in doing this. We're looking for something that truly is a needle in a haystack in terms of finding out. So one of the things to do, of course, is ask where there's differences. Where are there differences that seem to fall out from this? And looking at certain countries, I think, is going to be a help and try to figure that out. But it's not going to be easy. Questions from the?
Something, let's see. Whoa. I'll read this. We'll see how it goes. Anonymous. Before we have access to the research to make these newer, more effective strategies widely available, what can obese folks do? Should they not do the usual weight management strategies, calorie restriction, increase physical activity?
Oh, I think those strategies are good. The strategies that we're talking about, moderate, reasonable exercise, and controlling your diet, are actually good things to do. But they may not make a big difference in terms of person's weight. You don't necessarily have to make a big difference in the person's weight to get some benefit from that. But they will have other effects on health that are independent of BMI and weight. So that would be the situation. But we have to be careful about what the idea is. Where I come concern is that the severely restrictive diets that are used to cause rapid weight loss are ones at which we are asking for these adaptive processes to come in full bore that are going to basically potentially create problems. The other thing I think is important to find out, some people actually do achieve weight loss and weight stabilization with exercise and diet. Some people do. They're the minority, but I think one of the things to start looking at, a lot of the focus has been on what are they doing that seems to be right. But one of the things I think we also should be looking at is what are the factors that have led to the weight gain to begin with? because I think some type of acute changes that occur that result injury, some type of other illness that occur where you get weight gain, I think those are much easier to be able to adjust in terms of behavioral and other type of interventions. I think those will work. I think the ones that are much more a problem is when there's been some type of chronic. These adaptive processes kind of look back in terms, they have a memory in terms of where you were. And so as long as you don't develop too long a skill memory, I think it's possible to do interventions.
Next question. What is the practical lifestyle changes to take advantage of your hypothesis of adaptive mechanisms?
Mine is look for a good diet, but don't diet. I mean, literally everything people tell you is in terms of reasonable physical activity and looking at the quality of your diet are good things to do for health. And if you basically have, and my feelings are you don't expect too much in terms of the weight loss part of it. If you don't expect too much and you're willing to make this lifetime, because I think this is the issue. We live long lives. And so what we're interested in is how this influences us over a long period of time. And so establishing different changes in your basically your approach to life can have really major positive effects as long as you don't expect too much. Okay. And the one I use is there are things that I would love to do that won't happen. Okay. So I have to look at this as so, but what can happen, and what can happen is I can improve my lifestyle. And that will have a beneficial effect.
The next one is, what are your thoughts on intermittent fasting versus calorie restriction for weight loss?
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a lot of stuff on this. This is intermittent fasting, where you basically fast for a period of time and then you go back to consuming. I'm not comfortable with that. I have really concerns about it, but I don't have, it's not an area that I've actually actively researched. Now, I do know that when you have a longer period of time of dieting with weight loss, and then you have weight regain, what happens almost always is when you lose weight, you will lose a certain amount of fat and you'll lose a certain amount of muscle. If we do the gene therapy, you lose a lot more fat. Okay. But with a normal type of caloric restriction, you will lose a combination. When you regain, there's a preferential increase in fat. And so when people do this cycling, their body composition will change. Even if their weight doesn't become higher than it was before, their body composition will change in a manner that is not desirable. Okay, but I think this intermittent type stuff is you're not looking for it. And I suspect that there's probably some individuals, and this is what I'm trying to get across. I don't think there's going to be a solution that's on the basis of works on everybody. I think that they're basically, but we have to know is who things are going to work on. That's the key.
Here's a slightly different aspect of it. Is there a critical time period during which leptin receptors develop or change? Like during adolescence or later in life? In other words, is there much on the change in leptin receptors?
Yeah, I'm not sure all that much is known about the actual receptor, but what we do know is that there's a situation that has, if you're very leptin sensitive, you're in a situation where you have the highest percentage of the hormone goes across the blood-brain barrier as a percentage. As you start increasing the leptin levels, you have a smaller and smaller percentage that goes across. We also have a situation where leptin is a hormone that has both very positive and potentially very negative effects. It's an immune modulator, very important. The children who were leptin receptor deficient or leptin deficient before we had a cure for leptin deficiency, those children never made it to being adulthood. They died. They did not die of obesity. They died of infection. So leptin is really important. The problem is it's also something that can actually aggravate inflammation. So it's one of those, as we're looking at it as having to be very, very careful when we start talking about this as being a factor that we're going to use. We were very pleased to see when we increased the amount of leptin in the brain, we reduced the amount circulating in the blood. That should be reducing its pro-inflammatory capacity. We know that in a lot of systems, we need very little for it to be able to function as allowing growth and so forth to occur. Okay, but these are fun. It's a complex system.
Okay, this is the public health question.
Okay, good.
How can we get these messages out about interventions of behavior change for health improvement, but not necessarily significant weight change, out to the public and to healthcare providers making dietary weight loss recommendations?
It is tough. And I'll tell you that from the position of osteoporosis research. We use something, here we have, in fact, I'm really surprised that I didn't use BMD accidentally, maybe I didn't notice it, bone mineral density versus BMI. Bone mineral density has the same issues, that it's a ratio to two variables. And so it's the sort of thing, people who are determined to be osteoporotic based on having a very low bone mineral density. Therefore, what they want to see is that they're not osteoporotic. They want to see that they have an improvement in their skeleton by having this number go up, even though you don't need to have that number come up. Because what we need is that we have other ways of reflecting your risk that basically say you can reduce your risk by doing certain things, by lowering your bone turnover, that doesn't require this to change. Well, this is a problem obviously you're going to have with BMI, is because what we want to be able to get across is that BMI, okay, this helps us a little bit, but the first thing is to get across the practitioner. We have to get those people with the idea that really the most important thing is the nutrition and the activity. And we can have major inroads on a lot of problems by being able to do that. And with the idea that if you do this for a reasonable period of time, you will probably see some sort of benefit that's going to occur on your body mass index. You will see some, but don't expect to go, we have to get across, don't expect somebody to go from 35 or 33, let's say this upper end of normal, our normal distribution, down to 23. Don't expect that unless there's some type of unusual circumstances where you might be able to predict it. We'll look at the ideas we're looking for. Hey, let's lose 10 pounds. Will you feel better? Do that first. And guess what? Most people will feel better. And maybe if they feel better, and then the other part is which I've tried to, it's really a struggle, is this whole idea of people's perception of themselves, appearance. So I think that's something we have to figure out how to do a better job of getting across, is that, okay, this is the way you are. And guess what? You can probably, I don't know, maybe you blame your parents or whatever you do, your circumstances, but this is who you are. And so what you need to do is say, okay, what can I do that will make me healthier and feel better? And I don't think it's necessarily going to be a loss of a lot of weight because I think that's going to be really tough. Some people maybe, but most it will be tough. 2/3 to 3/4 are going to regain all that weight that they lose from one of these things within a few years. And in the process of losing that weight, they're an increased risk for a number of nasty conditions occurring. And so I think the idea is, let's start out with something to see if we can see an effect, make you feel better. Okay, I think you can do that physiological, but can you do that mentally? That's the hard part, I think. And that goes beyond my skill level.
Okay. I think that will be
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.